Hello and welcome again. It's the Roman poet Juvenal who is credited with coining the phrase quis custodiet ipsos custodes, which translates into who will guard the guards. This problematic question becomes most critical when we reach the topmost level of guardianship. At the lower levels, there's always a superior to whom the ranking officer has to account for their decisions and actions. In the real world, the question has infinitely more gravity than most people suppose. Those who seek to enslave us to their demands make constant and very effective use of such devices as confusing in people's minds the meanings of words like lawful and legal. This would be one of the topmost games played by those who perceive themselves as born to rule. Blurring the difference between natural or negative rights and legal or positive rights would be another, because conflating such concepts blinds people to the principles underlying each version. The Roman origin of this question stems from the introduction of the Praetorian Guard by Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. Charged with securing the emperor's person and wealth, Augustus's personal fortune was estimated at more than $4 trillion in today's currency. The Praetorians quickly and effectively widened their influence over the Senate and all other nodes of power under Roman influence. They were frequently involved in the assassinations of emperors they didn't like, and came to occupy the positions of extreme and clandestine power that are today occupied by intelligence services such as the CIA, MI6, FSB, Mossad, and so forth. These organisations, like the Praetorians, have access to virtually unlimited and unaccountable funding and follow agendas which are virtually indecipherable to the general public. Agendas decided by people whose names are entirely unknown to those whose lives they seek to control. One of the primary goals is to create so much confusion and distrust in society that people don't know who or what to believe, and exist in a constant state of stress and indecision. Individuals reduced to such conditions are easily manipulated by propaganda or orchestrated campaigns of narrative, such as public health concerns, for example. These similarities of behaviour and psychopathy, although separated apparently by almost 2 millennia, are much more aligned by design than coincidence. E.M. Burlingame, an American historian, has produced a series of fascinating podcasts and books on this phenomenon, which continue to shed light on the situations stemming from actions in 17th century England, which are still functioning coherently until today. A link to one of these, which can be followed up further at the viewer's personal preference, is provided in the comments box. It contains far more detail than can be explained in this type of video and is highly recommended for those seeking to gain a broader yet more detailed understanding of events and situations we see around us today. Burlingame highlights crucial points in the history of the Praetorians and, more importantly, that of their intellectual and philosophical heirs, who, he points out, have never been entirely eradicated and still function today as the source of most of the worst ills assailing human society. He begins with the decision by Emperor Constantine to once and for all put an end to the evil machinations of the Praetorians, which he initially does by defeating them decisively in the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. This was achieved where former emperors had failed, because Constantine was an able general and had been able to build up factions in the military who were more loyal to him than the Praetorians. The few surviving Praetorians were banned from ever returning to Rome and established a refuge in the lagoon area which became Venice. There they established the Venetian banking system, which they used to gradually subjugate peoples to their rule by enslaving them with debt-based financial systems. The constant tribal conflicts in what is now part of the Balkan area in Europe provided a lucrative form of profit for bankers willing to fund both sides in any war, and their influence spread wider across Europe as time wore on. Eventually, however, problems arose for these Venetians when the Byzantine or Ottoman Empire began advancing westward in the wake of the decline of the Western Roman Empire. For the Praetorians, as we might term them for want of another name, the writing was on the wall. Islam forbids usury, as did English common law, and the time had come for them to seek a further refuge from whence they could continue their nefarious financial and political practices without having to engage in personal warfare with an implacable foe. That job was left to the Christian monarchs and feudal lords of Europe, whom they could of course fund in these wars. Looking around, they found in the Netherlands a world-class port and trading empire, which was winning a war of liberation from Spanish subjugation, and this offered great prospects of a new centre of operations. And just over the water was an even better prospect, another great trading empire with the world's best naval power as a safeguard from any opposing force, one which had not been invaded for almost 600 years, England. E.M. Burlingame explains how the Venetians/Praetorians moved into the Netherlands and soon established their banking system. The English East India Company was not doing as well as earlier, and the Dutch bankers saw an opportunity to upstage it with their own Dutch East India Company, using the English name as a scapegoat for the policies that the Dutch/Venetian/Praetorian bankers would like to implement in their colonialist expansionary ventures. When planning criminal or harmful policies to be inflicted on others, it's always a good idea to have someone else to blame when the occasional balloon goes up. That looked like a plan, but how to implement it? The English had a long-established system of common law, where monarchs and feudal laws were accountable to the people they oversaw by such things as Magna Carta 1215, and similar feudal arrangements existed in much of Europe. The English in particular, despite being initially composed of a hybrid mix of ethnicities, comprising amongst others Celts, Picts, Gales, Scots, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Danes, Bretons, to name just some, had coalesced into a coherent civilization under Alfred the Great and others, which held in common the three cardinal principles of sound constitutional stability. These are 1. Individual sovereignty, an individual owns himself. 2. The derivative right to personal property. And 3. The rule of law, not the rule of any one individual over another. In fact, they are the only people to have ever established a civilization to have these three principles. It's a combination which Burlingame refers to unabashedly as Englishness, and which he claims, truthfully, to exist also in the United States, where again, many different ethnic groups coalesced into accepting the three principles just outlined. The same happened in other Commonwealth countries which were established and also accepted immigrants from different ethnic backgrounds. These principles are a stumbling block to any potential tyrant, as long as the people in sufficient number stand up for them. So how to undermine this bulwark of strength to enable infiltration and eventually subjugation? The Praetorians saw that throughout Europe, the feudal system bound communities together in strong reciprocal duties and responsibilities between the lords and monarchs and their peoples. What if these bonds could be weakened by moving the centres of authority and power further away from the common people, towards more centralised nodes? This would mean that there would be fewer ostensible rulers to corrupt with bribes and/or blackmail, making their task of debt enslavement easier to accomplish. In the Netherlands in the early 17th century, there were new schools of philosophical thought springing up. Spinoza belonged to one of these, who saw the relationship between what was popularly considered the law of God and the understanding of nature or natural law. René Descartes, although from France, spent much of his life in the Netherlands during what became known as the Dutch Golden Age. Other influential Dutch thinkers included Desiderius Erasmus, and the general thrust of these schools of thought were moving away from religious bases like Christianity or Judaism and towards rationalism and a scientific approach. Spinoza, a Jew by birth, ended up being excommunicated from both Judaism and Christianity. Yet the general atmosphere in Dutch culture became one of open-mindedness and liberalism in thought. Into this mix came thinkers from other parts of Europe, and one of these was John Locke, whose thoughts on the three principles of constitutionalism, particularly with reference to natural law, were pivotal in the development of constitutional law as envisaged by the American revolutionaries. One wonders to what extent the development of these rationalist liberalist views were encouraged by the Dutch/Praetorian bankers. Patronage of artists and visionaries was common in those times, and there's no doubt that some philosophers were habitually hard up and some received patronage of some degree. How much was Locke's thinking influenced by the adoption into his brilliant views on natural law of the concept of liberal or parliamentary democracy? On the face of it, it's a concept which rounds out the philosophy of everyone being equal, namely that all have a say in who are the elected representatives in Parliament. In practice, however, the principle of majority rule is completely inimical to the concept of individual sovereignty. For why should the majority have any more authority to command the minority than any one individual over another? It's arguable that the Praetorians in the Netherlands saw Locke as a major plank in their platform for undermining and disposing of the safeguards of feudalism and individual sovereignty, and gave him every encouragement. Bankers are notorious for leaving as little as possible to chance, are they not? Burlingame explains that the contentions between Charles I and Parliament were well known to the Dutch bankers, and they encouraged the development of events leading to the English civil wars of the 1640s, which, sadly for English constitutionalism as expressed in Magna Carta, resulted in the only execution of an English monarch. Burlingame argues that Cromwell recognised belatedly what a mistake that had been, and indeed tried to delay the ascendancy to constitutional primacy of Parliament, realising that the bankers had eyes on England as the most superb refuge or stronghold for their practices. Cromwell, however, died, and the monarchy was restored somewhat ineffectually under Charles II in 1660. He was succeeded by James II, who, despite receiving a bad press from the eventual victors in the battle, is on record as supporting the rule of law as specified in Magna Carta, including trial by jury. The time was now ripe for the Dutch Praetorian bankers, and with the connivance of several influential parliamentarians and members of England's so-called elites, James was deposed by an army under their control, and William of Orange was installed along with his wife Mary on the throne in 1689. The marriage to Mary added a sort of bogus legitimacy to this claim to the throne because she was, of course, the daughter of the deposed King James II. In 1688-89, the Bill of Rights was written but not enacted, and the entire episode was proclaimed as the Glorious Revolution. Remembering that history is always written by the victors, E.M. Burlingame, along with any others who understand the principles involved, recognise this as anything but. It was instead an inglorious coup, sponsored by foreign bankers and aided and abetted by homegrown traitors, who drew the line at actually proclaiming Parliament as supreme. That would have been treason, which could have brought retributive action, but were content to let this fiction live on in the minds of subsequent generations. Burlingame is a little too effusive in his praise of the Bill of Rights, perhaps because of its modern importance in American history, but the fact remains that it is a fiction, as it is not upheld in British jurisprudence and is anyway superfluous to the liberties already protected under Magna Carta. The Bank of England was established in 1694 to function not as a people's bank, but as the centre of the spider's web, which extended itself into global banking and the debt/slavery system which has ensnared the world ever since. And the victory of the Praetorians was complete. The English lost that battle. But Praetorian-style banking is always built on a fraud, and frauds always eventually unwind when the truth emerges. We are now at such a point where the entire global banking structure teeters on the brink of collapse, and it's time to confront the Praetorians again, as they will attempt to re-establish their supremacy through various means. History shows that it's better to confront such frauds and criminals before it comes to a physical fight, since they will stop at nothing to maintain their illegitimate power. Thank you for watching.